Have you ever noticed how certain philosophical or spiritual insights, when shared prematurely, are often misinterpreted or even ridiculed by those who have not yet walked the same path? There is something profoundly transformative about philosophical awakening, especially when guided by Kant's rigorous principles, which creates a kind of chasm between our new understanding of the world and the perception of those around us. This chasm is not only intellectual, but also existential, marking a fundamental distinction between different modes of being and perceiving. Most people live immersed in what Kant would call the phenomenal world, accepting appearances as ultimate reality without questioning the foundations of their knowledge or the principles that govern their actions. When we begin to awaken to the deeper questions of Kantian philosophy, when we question the nature of knowledge, freedom, and morality, we often find ourselves alone in our quest, misunderstood by those who have not yet confronted such questions. Kant's concepts, with their precision and depth, often seem inaccessible to those who haven't dedicated time and effort to understanding them, creating a barrier between philosophical knowledge and its practical application in everyday dialogue. Many of us have experienced that uncomfortable feeling of inadequacy when we try to communicate profound Kantian insights, only to be met with blank stares or outright rejection. I promise that by the end of this reflection, you will have a clear understanding of which aspects of your Kantian philosophical awakening are prudent to keep private and why. This knowledge will not only protect you from unnecessary negative reactions, but will also fundamentally transform your approach to philosophical communication, allowing you to discern when, how, and with whom to share the fruits of your awakening. Most importantly, understanding Kantian principles of philosophical discretion now can make an immediate difference in your social and intellectual life, avoiding misunderstandings and cultivating more authentic relationships with those who are genuinely prepared for such conversations. Let us explore together the 5 aspects of Kantian spiritual awakening that require the most careful discretion. The first aspect that a spiritually awakened person, according to Kantian philosophy, must keep in reserve is their transformed understanding of the nature of knowledge. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant establishes that we can never know things as they are in themselves, the noumena, but only as they appear to us through our forms of intuition and categories of understanding, the phenomena. This revolutionary insight completely destabilizes the naive confidence in the human capacity to grasp absolute reality. For the person who has internalized this understanding, the world never seems the same again. Where there were once certainties, there is now an awareness of the fundamental limitations of our knowledge, an epistemological humility that recognizes the insurmountable limits of our reason. But trying to communicate this transformed perspective to someone still firmly anchored in the natural attitude, who believes they have direct and unproblematic access to reality itself, rarely yields positive results. At best, we are met with incomprehension, at worst with open hostility or accusations of relativism or nihilism. The average person interprets the Kantian position as a denial of reality, when in fact it is a more sophisticated understanding of the conditions of possibility for our knowledge of it. Therefore, it is prudent to keep one's transformed understanding of the limits of human knowledge private, avoiding unnecessarily destabilizing the epistemological confidence of those not yet prepared for such radical questioning. Rather than openly proclaiming that we can never know reality itself, it is wiser to demonstrate epistemic humility in one's own assertions, allowing others to observe and perhaps eventually question the source of this humility. I'll pause here and ask you directly. How many times have you tried to share a profound Kantian insight about the limits of human knowledge only to be met with incomprehension or even hostility? That feeling of isolation, when you realize that your transformed understanding of reality has created a chasm between you and those still living in a state of philosophical slumber? You are not alone. Many of us carry this quiet restlessness, this desire to find others who truly understand the Copernican revolution that Kant initiated in our understanding of knowledge. I'd love for you to share your experience in the comments. It could be something simple, like, "The biggest challenge I faced when trying to communicate my Kantian understanding was D." Your comment not only helps me create content more targeted to your real needs, but also creates a community where others, who may be facing the same obstacles as you, can feel understood and less alone in their philosophical journey. It is through this sincere exchange that we grow together. So please pause the video for a moment and share your experience. Your voice matters more than you might think. The second aspect that requires discretion is his transformed understanding of freedom and moral autonomy. In the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, Kant establishes a crucial distinction between heteronomy, where our actions are determined by external forces or natural inclinations, and autonomy, where we act according to laws we give ourselves through reason. For Kant, true freedom does not consist in doing what we want, following our natural inclinations, but in acting according to the categorical imperative, with principles that could be universalized without contradiction. This conception of freedom as rational self-determination is radically different from the common understanding of freedom as the absence of external constraints. For someone who has internalized the Kantian view, true freedom requires discipline, self-control, and voluntary submission to universal rational principles. But trying to explain this transformed conception of freedom to someone who still understands freedom primarily as the ability to satisfy natural desires and inclinations often leads to fundamental misunderstandings. Their quest for moral autonomy can be interpreted as rigidity, their commitment to universal principles as dogmatism, their internal discipline as repression. Therefore, it is prudent to keep your Kantian understanding of freedom private, avoiding explicitly imposing this view on others or openly judging their choices from this perspective. Instead, demonstrate your conception of freedom through your own actions, allowing others to observe and perhaps question the source of your moral consistency. The third aspect that requires discretion is his transformed perspective on human dignity and the categorical imperative. In groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, Kant argues that we should treat humanity, whether in our own person or in the person of any other, always as an end in itself, never simply as a means. This view sets an extremely high standard for human interactions, one that fundamentally questions many of our social, economic, and political practices. For the person who has internalized this principle, it becomes painfully clear. How many of our everyday interactions involve the subtle or overt instrumentalization of other human beings, treating them as means to our ends rather than ends in themselves? This awareness can make it difficult to comfortably participate in social practices that once seemed innocuous, but are now recognized as ethically problematic. But openly expressing this discomfort, criticizing common practices from the perspective of the categorical imperative, is rarely well received. You may be perceived as morally superior, judgmental, and disconnected from the practical realities of social life. Therefore, it is prudent to keep your transformed understanding of human dignity and the categorical imperative private, avoiding explicit criticism of practices that others accept without question. Instead, quietly incorporate respect for human dignity into your own actions, making choices that honor the categorical imperative without necessarily announcing the philosophical principles that guide them. The fourth aspect that demands discretion is your transformed perception of religion and spirituality. In Religion Within the Limits of Mere Reason, Kant offers an interpretation of religion that emphasizes its rational moral content over its historical or dogmatic elements. For Kant, true religion does not consist of external rituals or supernatural beliefs, but of an inner commitment to the moral law. This view may conflict with more traditional or institutional forms of religiosity, which often emphasize obedience to external authorities, acceptance of specific doctrines, or participation in ritualistic practices. For someone who has internalized the Kantian view, spirituality becomes primarily a matter of moral conscience and ethical development, not of external conformity or transcendent experiences. But openly expressing this transformed understanding of religion in contexts where more traditional forms of religiosity predominate can lead to accusations of heresy, intellectual arrogance, or lack of faith. You may be perceived as threatening deeply held beliefs or disrespecting valuable traditions. Therefore, it is prudent to keep your Kantian understanding of religion and spirituality private, avoiding unnecessary theological debates or direct criticism of forms of religiosity that others find meaningful. Instead, live your own moral understanding of religion discreetly, allowing others to observe how your ethical principles manifest themselves in your actions, without necessarily articulating the philosophical basis of those principles. The fifth and final aspect that requires discretion is his transformed understanding of happiness and the purpose of life. In the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant argues that the true purpose of human existence is not the pursuit of happiness, understood as the satisfaction of desires and inclinations, but the realization of moral dignity through action in accordance with the categorical imperative. For Kant, we are worthy of happiness only to the extent that we act morally, and true satisfaction comes not from the gratification of desires, but from the awareness of having fulfilled our moral duty. This view contrasts sharply with more hedonistic or eudaimonistic conceptions of happiness, which identify it primarily with pleasure, satisfaction, or self-fulfillment. To the person who has internalized the Kantian view, the pursuit of happiness as the ultimate end of life seems superficial, while the commitment to moral dignity, even at the expense of personal happiness, becomes the true purpose of existence. But openly expressing this prioritization of morality over happiness in a world that widely celebrates the pursuit of personal happiness as the ultimate goal of life is rarely well received. You may be perceived as ascetic, repressed, and incapable of enjoying life's pleasures. Therefore, it is prudent to keep your Kantian understanding of happiness and life's purpose private, avoiding explicitly questioning others' pursuits of happiness or imposing your more austere, view of the purpose of existence. Instead, live quietly according to your own moral principles, allowing others to observe how your commitment to moral dignity manifests itself in your life without necessarily articulating the philosophical basis for that commitment. These 5 aspects of Kantian spiritual awakening that call for discretion are not merely arbitrary restrictions on communication, but reflect a profound understanding of the nature of philosophy and spiritual development. Kant's philosophy is not merely a set of theories to be learned intellectually, but an invitation to a complete transformation in our understanding of the world and ourselves. This transformation cannot be communicated directly through words or arguments, but must be experienced internally through a gradual process of questioning, reflection, and reorientation of our fundamental perspective. It is an awakening that occurs in stages as we successively confront the limits of our knowledge, the nature of our freedom, the demands of human dignity, the authentic meaning of religion, and the true purpose of our existence. Attempting to accelerate this process in others through the direct communication of advanced insights is rarely successful and may, in fact, impede one's own development by provoking resistance or premature rejection. The discretion Kant would recommend to the spiritually awakened is therefore not an act of concealment or dishonesty, but an expression of respect for each individual's unique journey and a recognition of the necessary conditions for true philosophical and spiritual development. It is an application of the categorical imperative itself, treating others not as objects to be converted to our vision, but as autonomous subjects, whose growth must occur at their own pace and according to their own path. This does not mean that we should never share our philosophical or spiritual insights, but that we should do so with discernment, sensitivity, and respect for the current limits and capacities of our interlocutors. We must learn to recognize those who are genuinely open and ready for certain insights, adapting our communication to their current level of understanding, offering not complete answers, but questions and perspectives that can stimulate their own inquiry and development. This discernment about what, when, and with whom to share is not only a matter of social prudence, but also an expression of philosophical wisdom. In the philosophical tradition, from Plato to Kant, we find the recognition that certain philosophical insights cannot be communicated directly, but must be discovered through a process of guided inquiry and personal reflection. Plato uses dialogues and myths to indirectly communicate what cannot be said directly. Kant distinguishes between the public and private use of reason, recognizing that there are appropriate and inappropriate contexts for the expression of certain ideas. This tradition of indirect communication and discernment is not intellectual elitism, but a recognition of the nature of true philosophical knowledge as something that must be internally realized, not merely received externally. By practicing discretion regarding the 5 aspects of Kantian spiritual awakening we have discussed, we are not denying others access to truth, but rather respecting the conditions necessary for their own authentic discovery of that truth. This does not mean, however, that we should remain completely silent about our philosophical and spiritual perspectives. Discretion is not the same as absolute silence. There are ways to share philosophical insights that respect our interlocutor's current level of understanding and encourage their own inquiry and development. We can use analogies, metaphors, and stories to indirectly communicate what cannot be said directly. We can ask questions that invite reflection rather than offer definitive answers. We can share aspects of our own philosophical journey in a way that inspires curiosity rather than imposes conclusions. And above all, we can demonstrate through our actions and lifestyle the fruits of philosophical awakening, allowing others to observe and perhaps eventually question the source of this transformation within us. The goal is not to permanently conceal our transformed understanding, but to communicate it in ways that are truly useful and accessible to others on their own journey of development. The practice of philosophical discretion is also not an invitation to hypocrisy or compartmentalization of our lives. It is not about presenting a public face that contradicts our private convictions, but about finding ways to live authentically according to our transformed understanding without imposing it unnecessarily on others. It is possible to incorporate Kantian insights into our daily lives, in our decisions, relationships, and commitments, without needing to explicitly announce the philosophical principles that guide them. It is possible to demonstrate epistemological humility, moral autonomy, respect for human dignity, rational spirituality, and commitment to moral duty in ways that are observable to others without being imposing. This lived authenticity, more than any verbal communication, is the true testimony to the value and truth of our philosophical and spiritual understanding. By living consistently according to Kantian principles, we create a living example that can inspire others far more powerfully than any argument or theoretical explanation. Ultimately, the discretion we recommend here is not a limitation to philosophical communication, but a more sophisticated and effective expression of it. It is a recognition that true philosophy is not merely a matter of conveying information or arguments, but of cultivating a transformation in how we understand the world and ourselves. This transformation cannot be imposed from without, but must be discovered and realized within. By practicing discretion in relation to the 5 aspects of Kantian spiritual awakening we have discussed, we are not abandoning philosophical communication, but elevating it to a more respectful and effective form. We are recognizing that true philosophical awakening does not occur through passive acceptance of conclusions offered by others, but through an active process of questioning, reflection, and internal reorientation. And we are honoring each individual's unique journey, trusting that those who are genuinely seeking truth will find their own path, at their own pace, to the transformative insights that Kant's philosophy has to offer. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by the complexity of deciding what to share and what to keep private on your Kantian philosophical journey, know that you are not alone. The art of wise philosophical communication doesn't have to be lonely or confusing. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and join this community of people who, like you, seek clarity amid the challenge of living and communicating deep philosophical understanding in a world that isn't always ready to receive it. By subscribing, you'll receive weekly reflections that transform seemingly inaccessible philosophical concepts into practical guidance for navigating the complexities of spiritual communication. We're not just studying philosophy, we're learning to live wisely, communicate discerningly, and awaken with integrity. Click the subscribe button now, not as an obligation, but as a gift for your own philosophical development. And if this content brought you any clarity today about how to navigate the delicate balance between authenticity and discretion on your Kantian journey, please leave a like as a way of saying that we are together in this search for true knowledge and its wise expression. Remember, understanding when to keep certain aspects of your spiritual awakening. Private is not an act of concealment, but an expression of deep respect for each person's unique journey toward truth